All right, good morning, team, and welcome to our first session for the final day of the conference. Lovely to have your company. For those of you who've just joined us, welcome. And there is the opportunity, of course, to catch up with this morning's speech on our YouTube channel if you would like to do so. Now, we're starting off today with a panel session, and we have an esteemed group of experts who are going to lead this discussion with us, and you're more than welcome to join in at any stage. So the topic is Sustainable Aviation Fuel, Reinventing Hydrocarbons, and our moderator for this panel is Ed Mason. Now, Ed is the Chief Executive Officer for Jet Zero. I did check the program as well for a typo, but Jet Zero is a legitimate entity. So would you like to come up and join us, Ed? And as he comes up, he does have a former foot in the resources industry as well. He tells me he's a reformed resources industry person. So it's going to be Ed's job to introduce our panel today. So would you please make him very welcome?
Thank you for the introduction. So joining me on stage, I'll ask Edward Choi from Alperion Bioenergy, who is the Chief Strategy and Investment Officer for Alperion. Then we've got Genevieve To, who is the Head of Marketing for Flyoro, a homegrown company here for Singapore. And then we've got Thomas McMahon, CEO of ACX, one of the largest carbon exchanges in the world. Please welcome them on stage. Thank you. So, sustainable aviation fuel. This is a very exciting industry, and it's, I think, if you're at a future-facing commodity conference, I couldn't be more excited about SAF as a commodity. When I benchmark what we've seen in rare earths, critical minerals, and other kind of products that are needed to decarbonise the transport sector. As a sort of scene setter, we've got a great lineup of speakers today, primarily because we represent each part of the supply chain. Edward and Alperion Bioenergy, and I'll get him to introduce in a second, that company is one of the largest collators of feedstock to make sustainable aviation fuel. Based in Singapore, they collect a lot of waste products from around this region. Many of that waste product is used into the creation of sustainable aviation fuel. My company, Jet Zero Australia, is one of the leading developers of sustainable aviation fuel projects in Australia. We actually have a partnership with Alperion, but we are also looking at projects elsewhere, and so we sit in the production stage of the supply chain. We then have Thomas, who represents the carbon aspect, and this is all about carbon and decarbonising the aviation sector. And then Genevieve's company is on the blending and distribution into airports. So we've got the supply chain covered here, which is a rare occurrence actually on stage. So the aviation sector represents about 3% of the emissions of carbon in the entire world. It's one of the largest contributors of CO2 emissions in the transport sector. And when we look at solutions to decarbonise transport, we have clearly electrification of heavy and light vehicles. When we look at the marine sector, there are many solutions on hand, and I think medium to long-term hydrogen is meant to play a big role in it. But when we look at the aviation sector, I can tell you right now, we are not going to be flying on hydrogen electric aircraft for a long time, particularly on long-haul travel. There is a role for that sort of technology in maybe short-haul hops, but when we're looking at long travel distance, particularly like Singapore, which has got some long destinations to travel to, sustainable aviation fuel is the solution. Why is that? It's still 7 times the energy density as the most efficient battery out there today. So we cannot physically make a battery to fit inside a plane that's going to travel the distances we need. If we liquefy hydrogen at every airport around the world, SAF is still 4 times the energy density of liquid hydrogen at minus 53 degrees. I mean, at 253 degrees, it's not going to be easy to move. So when we look at the industry and how it's going to meet these aggressive decarbonisation targets set, and most airlines have set them, SAF is the solution. So what is SAF? It's still kerosene or jet fuel. Some key differences is it has a lower freeze point, it has slightly better energy density qualities, and it has no aromatics and sulphur, which means less contrails or smoke coming out the back of the engine. And then importantly, it reduces carbon emissions by around 70 to 80% per flight. And if we are to meet net zero by 2050, which a lot of airlines under IATA have committed to do, then that is the solution to move forward. And if you try and translate that into a trajectory of demand, we're going to go from a few billion litres of production here today in the world, including Singapore, which has a plant operated by Neste in production right now of SAF, to about a 500 billion litre market by 2050. This has got one of the most aggressive demand curves you can see out there in the world for any commodity. On top of that, if you break down just the mandates alone, there's going to be demand for about 160 billion litres by 2050. And when I say mandates today, France, Sweden, and Norway all mandate a 1% SAF blend on all flights leaving those countries. Next year, all of Europe has mandated a 2% SAF blend for flights going in and out of that country. Singapore a few weeks ago announced a 1% SAF blend by 2026, ramping up to 2 to 5% by 2030. And last year, Japan also announced a 10% SAF mandate blend by 2030. That's a very aggressive target. So whether you believe it or not, the demand for this commodity is coming, and we need to provide supply of that. So on that note, I'll hand it over to one of the biggest feedstock suppliers of SAF, which goes into the production process, and Edward, to talk about your business and how you see the opportunity for the SAF sector.
Sure. Thank you, Edward, for the introduction. So first of all, my name is Edward. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer at Apparent Bioenergy. We were set up 16 years ago. Now we operate across 10 countries. We are the largest collector of used cooking oil in this part of the world. So when we look at the demand, right, as Ed mentioned, it's really without doubt that the SAF demand is gonna hit. It's all driven by environmental policies that are already enshrined in the law, right? But when it comes to supply, it's really the bottleneck of the sector when it comes to feedstock. For example, in the US and the EU, almost everything that can be collected is collected. But when it comes to this part of the world, you look at Southeast Asia. So we recently engaged a management consultant to conduct a market study of how much feedstock is being collected now. And in Southeast Asia, the answer is only 17%. So the rest of the 83% is going down the drain. So when we look at what we are doing, we are actively expanding the market as well as educating, raising awareness of how we should be disposing the used cooking oil correctly. So of course there is a huge sustainability angle when it comes to our business, right? A lot of people, when they talk about sustainability, they only focus on the E, with a carbon tunnel vision, right? With the carbon savings aside, I think there is a very important social angle here as well with our business. So you look at Southeast Asia, right? Earlier I briefly mentioned about the awareness of illegal recycling of oil. In Indonesia, when you go to a hawker center on the street, you know how many times they recycle the used cooking oil? So there is a huge health hazard there. Aside from that, a lot of the local collector, we are empowering the economy there and giving them, jobs, and we saw some of the collectors switching from a banking career to collect oil from us. And some of them, make some pretty good money in doing that as well. But all in all, I think there is huge potential, in this part of the world when it comes to collecting waste-based feedstocks in Southeast Asia, and that's something we are focusing on in the short and medium term. Yeah, so this is what we're doing here at Apparent. I guess I will pass it to Thomas to talk about the credit side, carbon credit side of things.
Thank you very much. And nice to be here. I mean, my background is I come out of the commodity trading industry, and I began in the agricultural markets, so I have a lot of respect for what you're doing relative to the recyclability on the back end of oil. And then I moved into the energy space, and over the last 5 years I've been working in air carbon ACX, in the decarbonization space, right, the mitigation of our carbon footprints, and aviation is a large part of that. I built this here in Singapore, and the original name was Air Carbon. We were focused on aviation, and this was pre-COVID. And we thought that the airlines, including the state airline here, would be very, very proactive in adoption of a decarbonization policy. That was a false thought on my part. They don't care. They care today, and the reason why they care today is because the government has told them after 5 years, and coming out of COVID, all of us have either flown here from another place or we're flying locally, and we know that the costs have gone up dramatically. Aviation is very happy that COVID is over. and they're very happy to say that they're above their 2019 all-time previous peak, and now they've got to start to mitigate. And how do they mitigate? My company was set up through carbon credits, thinking that you would buy a voluntary credit which would offset that position in the aviation on a per passenger, per flight, per route basis, per mile. And that was incorrect, because the word voluntary is there and they're not going to do anything unless they're mandated. So now we've flipped it on its head, and now you've got a regulation that says that they have to decarbonize, and it's SAF that's going to be their feedstock. That's significantly different, and it changes the metric of demand fundamentally, and where the benefit for both of these people. They're on the supply side, as is Ed. I'm on the trading side. We want a clear price signal for this fuel, and also too, you want the whole stream of supply. So interesting, one of the things that we've set up, besides trading carbon credits, is now we've set up a biofuels division. So we can trade UCOME, and we can trade SAF as the supply chain comes up. But companies like Vopak, which may not be a name many people are familiar with, but Vopak runs storage facilities, tank farms. And they just dedicated a series of tanks here in Singapore that will be solely dedicated for biofuel storage, for trading and transportation. And that's really important to see how markets will scale as a result of it. So all of the pieces are falling in place, as well as the regulation. So now it's not voluntary, it's mandatory, and that changes the nature of this business and the opportunity going forward. So over to you.
All right, thank you. Okay, so now we've heard a lot from pretty much the upstream side, and also how trading works, especially for credits. For us, my name is Genevieve from Fly Oro. I focus a lot into the blending side of things for sustainable aviation fuels. So just think of us like an espresso machine, but instead for coffee beans, we do it for SAF. And we want to try to be able to put a blending system at any point of the supply chain that makes sense. Now, we think about conventionally what happens now. Blending is done upstream, directly at refineries. Once it's blended, then you deliver your SAF, your blended SAF, all the way to the airport. But we want to be able to decouple that and place it at the point, be it midstream or even last mile downstream, directly at the airports. And the reason we do so is a few things. We want to be able to benefit as many stakeholders as possible in the supply chain. So for one side of things, we are able to actually help to benefit suppliers like Ed to be able to have more blending hubs available and to be able to have access to these airports and supply their fuels to these airports and to these airlines. And for the airline's point of view, by having a blending machine like ours, we are able to pass down control and flexibility to them, where they are able to decide the blending ratio and volume that they would like to procure according to the market scene and cost. And I think it's very important for us to be aware that SAF itself is extremely expensive compared to Jet A1. It could be 3 times more expensive, and that's the reason why we see it moving very slow without any incentives or mandates. So as what Ed has mentioned earlier, Singapore, we already rolled out a mandate, 1%. This will also plan to increase to 3 to 5% starting from 2030, and that depends on how the supplies come online. We expect to have more supplies coming up end of this year and the following year as well. And currently what Singapore does is actually a very new concept, not seen in any other markets before, which is to set a passenger SAF levy. And this is a fixed cost between $3 and $16. So if you were to fly, for example, from Singapore to London, you have to pay a $16 SAF levy that's already borne into your ticket price, your flight ticket. And the reason why they do this is because they want to create certainty to consumers like ourselves, whereby we know how much we're paying for, which is a fixed price, and with that consolidated cost that's being aggregated, they will actually purchase fuel, SAF, from all these suppliers that will fly out of Singapore airport. So moving forward, we want to be able to also support these airports who have ambitions to actually try and get the SAF molecules and to basically supply all of the airlines. Yep.
Thank you, that's a great speech. I wanted to also add and talk a little bit about the other benefits other than just environmental that this industry has. We have 3 projects under development in Australia. Our most advanced project, Ulysses, named after Queensland butterflies up in Townsville. It's a $700 million SAF project, which will supply about 100 million litres of SAF by 2028. We are a big employer in that region. We're going to have close to 1,000 construction workers, but 100 full-time employees. But we're also providing fuel security in a region which is a big focus for the Army up there. And so we've been working very closely with Defence and others on that. And we know across the supply chain there are other industries that are feeding off the growth of this in Australia. In the technology we use in our plant, we also produce renewable diesel. We have a lot of interest from the mining sector for that renewable diesel, particularly in central Queensland. So again, we're involving a broad spectrum other than our partners, and I probably should have mentioned, we've had some great backing from an investment from Qantas, Airbus, and more recently Idemitsu from Japan that came in. And we've found that the industry is collaborating very well across regions. We've worked closely with all these people on stage here today and had strong support from both the Singapore and Australian governments for developing this industry together. So it has a very exciting future for that reason. And as I said, not just about the decarbonisation story, but also about other social benefits that this industry brings. I might throw over to Edward, because you're at the coalface of feedstock that we often hear is the challenge. What other risks or what particular risks within that space do you see going forward for growth in the SAF industry?
Sure. When it comes to the feedstock part of supply chain, I think there are two main risks. First one is really geopolitical risk. If you look at how most countries, when they understand feedstock is a bottleneck, they might implement certain export restrictions, as we have seen in Indonesia. There was some export ban, right? As of now, in the short term, we don't see much of these regulations, but going forward, when each countries would like to adopt SAF, would that be a problem, right? So there's one thing we're looking at, right? There's one risk here. And the second one is really when it comes to the sustainability certifications, especially when it comes to traceability. I'm not sure if the audience here have heard of this news, but in the second half of last year, there was a shipment of biodiesel from China to the EU, where the Chinese biodiesel company fraudulently used new cooking oil rather than used cooking oil to produce biodiesel, right? And as a result of this, there was an investigation from the EU into all the Chinese exported volume, but that's only because our sector is still very, very early stage. That's why we think a lot of these compliance and sustainability certifications will need to be implemented more rigorously, so that that will make the whole sector work. So these are the two risks that I see.
Great. And Thomas, on that, provenance, traceability, we hear about it, it's important.
Yeah.
But I think it's probably also worth, telling everyone how much these carbon certificates are worth in the SAF space. And they're a lot different to ARCUs and everything else you see. There's a huge premium. Yeah. And for that reason, also a good financing solution for a lot of these projects.
Yeah, there's no doubt about it. You mentioned the enhancement. I mean, when you bring new technologies or you change the use case of an existing supply stream, like used cooking oil, it's a game changer. I mean, for us, one of the things that we're seeing, and I've been on a number of phone calls over the last few weeks with people who are going to produce SAF in a lot of very unique ways. Want to use cooking oil yourself, your cane feedstock potentially. I was talking to guys last night from Florida, and they're going to use something called king grass, which it exists in certain regions of the world. It's very, what's called, in terms of North America, it's the sub-free zone, meaning above and below freezing lines in North America. But you've got this pyrolytic production facility, and you have the cellulitic, and those are the feedstocks, right? And you understand this, Ed, very much the science and that. But this is the opportunity to open up really the carbon credit market as a subsidy market. It enhances or incentivizes the change of behavior. And we know that today, that a SAF-based carbon credit that can be attached to production from any one of these three persons is worth about $16 per ton. And we're talking about demand well in excesses of 100 million tons in terms of in heading towards, like, from liters of production versus to tons on the underlying. This in and of itself, the transportation industry can support a $500 to $1 billion industry just from a subsidy standpoint, meaning the carbon credits that are created on the basis of SAF production, the enhancement. So this is an investable asset class just on that basis alone. So, yeah.
Nah, thanks, Tom. And Genevieve, one question for you. You've been a success story here in Singapore with the business growth. Can we expect to see these blending facilities in Australia anytime soon?
Yes, we actually recently just signed a deal to move into the state of Queensland. So more details will be up, but basically what we want to do is to be able to set more blending hubs around the world. And we also actually just closed our pre-Series A round, investment round, just recently, just a few months back. And basically our focus is really a lot into the Australian market and also into the US. Why the US? Mainly because, especially in the West Coast, it's very driven by incentives, and that's where we want to be able to situate ourselves as well, because a lot of suppliers are there too. Australia market, the government is actually trying a lot supporting suppliers side, and also they are also looking at doing a mandate. So we are also going to be positioning ourselves there and be ready when it comes online.
Great. Well, look, I think we're out of time. Look, this is a new industry. A lot of people don't understand it. Please reach out to any of us if you need to understand more or looking for opportunities to work with any of us in what we're doing. Yeah, I think that's a wrap.
Thank you so much, Shane. Really informative, and nice to see the innovations as well coming out of Australia. Thank you. Would you put your hands together for our panel, livening things up this morning? Right, now, I'd ask you all to take a chair with you as you leave, but that might be a bit rude. We'll do our own redecorating as we leave today. There we go, everyone's well trained. You can take one chair. There we go.